Welcome to the third in our Corporate Treasury Connectivity series, in which we will be discussing how to manage connectivity standards today and tomorrow. We have two experts from Volante, the sponsors, Fiona Hamilton, VP Europe and Asia, and Neil Clark, Marketing Engagement Director. And we have Mike Foy, who is Treasury Director, Mondelez International, and is pushing a corporate treasury improvement program right across the global Mondelez group. Starting with the general position, how do we manage the push towards globalization of standards in corporate to bank? Because the standards and guidelines, for example, the CGMP adoption, varies around the world. Where are we in this progress globally, Neil? How are corporates going to manage this varying rate of change?
Yeah, that's a good question. Just a bit of background on CGMP for people that don't know. CGMP is a body that's been around for about 5 or 6 years now. I've had involvement with the group for the last year. I'm the facilitator for Working Group 2, which is involved in the setting up of guidance for cash and account reporting. So this is the CAM-T messages. So it's all aimed at ISO 2002 messaging, which you'll know is becoming the sort of lingua franca for financial messaging and payments and financial messaging just generally. So the group really aims to look at standardizing the approach of usage of these messages between banks and corporates, so providing a standardized approach to the usage, the definitions, etc., for account reporting. In my
but
case,
it's not progressing easily across the world. Where is it progressing and where isn't it?
Well, you're correct. The group has 143 members now, of which nearly 50 of those are financial institutions. So there is a definite interest, and there is constant applications to join. So there is definite interest in both banks and corporates in this messaging and the standardized approach. It's fair to say that it's mainly the major banks that are driving this. So the large multinational global banks that are driving the push for adoption, as well as the larger corporates and treasury organizations. So there is a definite interest. There is a move forward to standardization, but yes, there is still, the world is a big place and things take time to move on, but there's a definite drive to adopt these standards.
Yeah, I would just add a little bit to that. I think it's one of those, sad facts is when people hear about standards, they automatically think, right, that's going to be a one size fits all. And then they go in and go, it's not quite right for us. So we'll create these bodies to come up with the standard based on the standard. So CGI stands for Common Global Implementation. But the reality is everybody wants the standard to work the way they want the standard to work. So, the length of time it takes for adoption is quite often driven by the fact that people go, oh, ISO 222, that's going to be the answer, that's the panacea. And then they realize that actually, if you're talking ISO 222 to Barclays, it'll be slightly different than if you're talking to Deutsche Bank or if you're talking to Bank of New York Mellon, et cetera, et cetera. So, I think sometimes it's just people getting their heads around the fact that it's all about usage guidelines based on those standards rather than, the standards per se themselves being the answer.
But Mike, how are you managing this? Because there are huge variations, as Fiona put it, between the usage of the standards. What do you do?
Well, I suppose we made a shortcut this at an early part of our implementation plan, which began in, honestly, probably 2 or 3 years ago. So what we took was a view of the banks we were likely to use for our global cash management as we rationalized. And we hit upon a standard format of XML version 3 to be going on with those key banks. Now, that takes out a lot of the lack of standardization from local flavors, or I beg your pardon, banking flavors, if you like. But it would still leave us with the situation in certain countries. We'll have, implementation guidelines for different countries. But by and large, the element where Barclays would differ from somebody else, we took that out of the equation for our payment side 3 or 4 years ago. And where it is that we want to proliferate the banking in and around the world and extend these straight-through processing processes that we have, What we're putting on the banks to do is to take our ISO XML 20022, as we've agreed with them, with a local flavour for whichever market we happen to be in. But if that's not receptive, that market is not receptive to ISO standards in any way, that hasn't developed, then we're putting the onus on conversion to the bank to put into the local clearing systems.
Is that what you are encountering, Volante?
Yeah, I mean, I think Mike's hit it on the head there. That, you know, there is always these days a certain amount of transformation, enrichment that has to happen at one end or the other. Now, whether it's the corporate treasury that makes sure that their messages adhere to whatever the target formats are and the local jurisdiction's requirements, or it's put onto to the bank as part of their service. So, you know, we talk to both corporates and banks, and different organisations have different preferences. Some would rather have the ownership within the walls of their organisation, and others would prefer to take the approach of saying, well, I'll give you what I can, Bank A, it's up to you to make sure that you massage it into the most appropriate format. But I think there is probably a trade-off there, because at the end of the day, none of these things are free. So if you're leveraging a huge amount of kind of transformation services onto your banking channels, at some point, whether it's based on the transactional costs or something else, the banks are not in it as a charity. If they have to build infrastructure and they have to build and maintain data models, etc., you know, at some point that is going to be filtered back as costs. But it may be that those costs are deemed acceptable rather than putting the infrastructure in at the corporate treasury end.
Moving to a different topic, but it's part of the same theme. The newer formats are being harmonized under CGMP, as you were describing, Neil, including the eBAM and the bank reporting standards, the BSB standards, which came from TWIST, CAMT 086. What's the position, and how can people like Mike use these standards, or do they have to wait?
If we look at the eBAM, with respect to CGMP, both eBAM and BSB are relatively new in terms of trying to create standardized guidelines on usage. eBAM now has actually, the CGMP group and eBAM has published just this year, I think, the first sort of tranche of guidelines for usage, although there's now some debate on correcting certain aspects of it. But there is a set of guidelines out there which can be used. BSB isn't really at that stage yet. So for bank services billing, there is a new group that was only set up in the last 6 months, where they are again looking to standardize the usage of the CAMT 86 message for this billing information. They're also working closely with the American AFP group, which publishes standard codes for use in the US, but actually globally for bank services, the definition of services that banks provide to their corporates. But again, so there is no specific guidelines published by CGMP yet on BSB. They are actively now looking to generate this, and really just to emphasize to corporates out there, they really do want corporates to be actively part of this group to help shape the guidance that will be eventually published.
But what does Mike do now? Mike, what are you doing now in eBAM and BSB?
No, I mean, a couple of things with the eBAM part of this in terms of, it's only now that the recommendations come out, as Neil pointed out, and there's also a differentiation between how people are standardising in there. It's not really gelling together as something where we could sort of leap in with a lot of faith and manage our relationships on the back of that. So until that settles down, and we think that's a way off, we still need to find a way of managing these things. And what we're looking to do is to really get the proprietary solutions from the banks at the moment. Now, that's only going to cater for those banks that we directly deal with. We're going to have multiple systems in order to manage all those things. It's not ideal, but we would prefer a systemized approach to any other paper, old mandated stuff we really need to draw a line under. And so really we're faced with maybe looking at transitional activity within proprietary systems before we could see the Swift eBAM solution as fully integrated and properly standardized across the banking population.
I mean, just to add, a lot of this is down to what we've sort of touched upon, what really the vendors can do. Obviously, the ERP treasury system vendors perhaps have arguably legacy systems. Maybe that's a bit harsh, but ultimately they need to be able to handle these new formats integrate them into their products so that you can successfully, use the more richer information that's provided with ISO 20022. Obviously, payments has been the first big push in this, which I think Mike alluded to, but perhaps the ISO messages for reporting, etc., perhaps have been slightly less. The take-ups have been a bit slower, and people are still using MT940s, which is fine, but often that's not rich enough information in this day and age that corporates are looking for. I guess that's the sort of thing that Mike would value.
Actually, picking up on that theme of not enough information, the ISO 20022 remittance messages are really full, but the problem is in the payment systems, like Nature and other B2B payment systems, they can't be included. How is Mondelez going to manage this, taking advantage of this? Because you have to decouple the payment and the remittance information and then recouple it, as Mike calls it. Is there a standard method of doing this? Mike, have you found one?
No, we haven't. We're obviously searching for one. And, just to explain, it's just that fullness of data that won't find its way through a clearing system has to arrive with the payment at the end, at the statement element, at the time you really want to reconcile the payment. So there's an element whereby the very rich data has to separate itself from the transition of that payment through the clearing system until you can receive it at the other end. Now, we kind of observe one or two movements within certain banks across our banking group who really want to see this develop more, but a bank can't do it in isolation. You need groups of banks to do it, and it's not quite within CGI. This is not, a method of delivery rather than the content of a particular message. So in terms of having an infrastructure whereby banks are able to communicate with each other and to handle this enriched data over and above the clearing systems and still give it back to us at the end as corporates and receivers of information, that's still a long way off development. And it really depends upon the speed of the banks to comply and integrate with one another, which is something they don't ordinarily do with without a big push and shove from the corporate clientele below them. So enable them to get to a place whereby we know that there is a standardized methodology behind the way in which they'll exchange data. And to my mind, you kind of need to find, how would you describe it? Maybe an information broker who will handle that data transition between bank and bank. The clearing system isn't. One bank system onto another is another, but you probably need a kind of information clearer in the center, which is a broker which can manage the reattachments.
Is that the sort of thing that information broker that Volante could do?
Well, certainly, with our technology, yes. I mean, I think what Mike's kind of talking there about is kind of like a service provider. So actually taking the organization or the architecture that we can provide and actually putting that up in a cloud somewhere and sourcing it. We have plans to do hosted services in the future, but they're at relatively early stages at the moment. But we've certainly been approached by a couple of banks to do things in that area. I think it's interesting, the extended remittance information. Actually, I've recently been taking part in the real-time payments technical subcommittee of ISO 20022. Actually, extended remittance information has been a big subject there, because the same issues are there as well. So I think trying to find a common mechanism, I think it's got to be along the lines of coming up with a standardized way of if you like, wrapping or enveloping the payments so that you have the payment payload as a PN001 or whatever, but having another just kind of like document block where you could put an EDI format, so a Nature format, an X12 format, an EDIFACT format, or something completely proprietary, which can then electively be stripped out and parked as that payment goes through and processes, and as long as you've got a common linkage. So the way that we view this is, I think the most important thing is to be able to normalize your data. So regardless of where the payment is coming from or where it's going to, if you normalize the payment instructions and then have linkages within that model to remittance information, which could be just in the shape of blobs, because at the end of the day, remittance information could be a PDF document, it could be an invoice, it could be anything, it could be a URL these days. You can't really say what that format's. If you have the ability to take a payment, normalize it, and then create the linkages within that database so that any ancillary information is linked to that payment, then that job of doing the reconciliation and adding it back in when it comes to the cash management side is much more achievable. But you've got to kind of like stage it somewhere in the middle.
But Mondelez is still left with proprietary solutions. There isn't a generic solution around at the moment.
Just to jump in there, without wanting to plug SAP's systems, but they are trying to create a standardized approach to payment processing and also issuing statements, etc., with remittance information, etc., on the financial services network, which is a standardized connection over the SAP's cloud technology that really tries to standardize single connectivity to global banks, providing a standardized way of receiving information and making payments, etc.
Mike, is that a solution for you?
It sounds as though it's, if everything is collected in the same way, standardized in the same way, the message flows are equal, they're understandable and interpretable. We use SAP, we've got it across the world. If everybody else used SAP, ERP across the world and did everything exactly the same way, then I think we've got a fit. And it sounds like it's substantially a good thing. It's not something I've heard all the detail about before. But I do wonder whether, where it is that we have isolated outposts where people are not quite on SAP, they're on a different ERP, they're in a different standard maybe, they'll still preserve their ways of doing things. The ERP system is not agnostic, the level of reporting and connectivity from those wouldn't be. So we'd still have probably some fallout. But I suppose looking at the bigger picture, if 70% of the population is on SAP, then 70% of the problem is solved in many ways.
Volante is at the heart of SAP's FSM system, so we're obviously very keen on that solution.
Mike, we need to close now, but what's your take from this conversation about standards? What is the key thing that you would do?
Not a lot different from what I'm doing at the moment. I think it almost sounds as though the thing to do is to maybe wait just a little. It is that there's a growing, I wouldn't call it storm, but there's a gathering of a way in which common purposes are going to be facilitated. But to get the full level of functionality that I think we probably all dreamed of maybe 2 or 3 years ago when we went into the ISO XML arena, and quite rightly as being pointed out, the standard is not quite a standard, it's a group of understandings with standard flavors across. I think that we continue our ways of working until we see more of a consolidation of effort in terms of the harmonization of approaches and banks being together, maybe ERP providers being together to find the portal which is going to suit the information requirements at both ends. Something is there that we're going to need. It's got to outgrow the bank clearing systems because they're patently not going to deliver the benefits. But mine is to carry on as we are for the time, but wait for more consolidation and harmonization.
And Volante, what is your take from the need to manage connectivity standards both today and tomorrow?
I think what the one major takeaway I would take from this is, hearing what Mike's got to say and also fitting that in with a lot of the conversations we've had with other corporate treasuries and payments banks, is that I think vendors have an ever increasingly large role to play in the whole scheme of things, because I think when you leave, the standardization process to a big group of banks, I don't know, 140, as Neil said, in terms of corporates and banks within CGI, an ISO in itself, which has God knows how many contributors, everybody has a slightly different agenda, and those things tend to, drag on over years and years, whereas vendors typically can be a lot more agile. So, if we see a lot of demand in the market for translation services, for remittance type services, then probably the onus is on us to go and grab that opportunity. And we might not get it right first time, but at least we would take something to the market and go, here's your starting point, let's work with you to actually get the real usage out of it. But, we can be probably quicker to market than a group of, a community of banks and corporate treasuries. So I'm taking some of this as kind of, input into our, product roadmap.
Thank you, Mike. Maybe the future is third parties to G everybody else up.
It could well be, yeah, market antagonizers, interrupters, disruptors.
Thanks, Fiona, Neil and Mike. That was most interesting and important. I look forward to welcoming CTMfile viewers to the fourth web chat in the Corporate Treasury Connectivity Series